welcome back to Alfred's Basic Adult Piano Course, Lesson Book Level 1. This video is Lesson 43, covering page 48 and page 49, introducing dotted quarter notes. All right, so we have recently learned about eighth notes. And as a review, an eighth note all by itself is half a beat. Now, when we introduced eighth notes initially, we said they often come in pairs, and that's true. So the reason I'm mentioning eighth notes is because with the dotted quarter note, we're still dealing with these half beats. So I'll explain what that means here in just a second. So on page 48, it says a dot increases the length of a note by 1/2 its value. So actually, before we get specifically into dotted quarter notes, so forget about eighth notes for just a second, and let's focus on half notes. So look at the first pink box there. It says a dotted half note is equal to a half note tied to a quarter note. So we learned that half notes are 2 counts. We learned that a quarter note is 1 count. And when you add it together, that's 3 counts, which is the same as a dotted half note. Several lessons ago when we did dotted half notes, I may have explained this, but if I didn't, I'll review it. So the dot is equal to 1/2 of the value of the note it's attached to. So if you have a dotted half note, the dot itself in that case is 1 beat, because the note that it's attached to, the half note, is 2 beats. So half of 2 is 1. So that dot in that case is 1 beat. The half note is 2 beats. Added together, a dotted half note is 3 beats or 3 counts. Either way, it's the same. So if you're taking a quarter note, this is the second pink box on page 48. A quarter note is 1 count. And so a moment ago, we said an eighth note is half a count. Okay, so music is math, right? Add them together. 1 count plus half a count equals 1.5 counts, which is a dotted quarter note. So in other words, the dot in this case represents half of a quarter note. So that dot is half a beat, kind of like an eighth note, right? So a dotted quarter note is 1.5 counts. Now you can memorize that because that will never change, at least when we're in 4/4 or 3/4 or 2/4 time signature. That will always be 1.5 counts. So if you just memorize that, that's fine. Just like you can memorize a dotted half note is 3 counts. But if you're one of those who's like, why? You have to know why for everything. Now you know why. When you break it down, the dot represents half the value of whatever note it's attached to. But we're going to focus on dotted quarter notes in this lesson. So going down below the pink boxes, it says clap or tap the following rhythm. Clap once for each note, counting aloud. So in other words, you can clap. I actually am just going to pick a key on the keyboard. I'm going to go with middle C here with, I'll just use my second finger. And I'm going to play this rhythm just on middle C. So when we look at this rhythm, notice 4/4 time. Always look at your time signature. So we know there's four beats in this measure. So what they're showing us here is actually, it's another way of writing these dotted quarter note rhythms. That may not be the best way to explain it, but let me explain just what's happening right here. You have a quarter note on beat 1, and you already know what a tie is. So that curved line under that quarter note, that's a tie. So the next thing you're playing, which is going to be on beat 2, is an eighth note, except it's not actually being played because of the tie. So when you get to beat 2, you're still holding that note or clap. Now on the end of beat 2, you see there's an eighth note. Now that one you will play. Okay, and then on beat 3, there's a quarter note, so that one you'll play. And remember, we're dealing with halves here because if there are any eighth notes present, we're dealing with halves. So we're back on beat 1, that quarter note is 1 and then on beat 2, we're still tied. But then on the end of beat 2, we have our eighth note that we do play. Beat 3, we have our quarter note. So if it's a quarter note, it's a full beat, both halves, 3 and. Now look at beat 4. We have a tie on that eighth note, so you're not going to play that eighth note. Okay, you're going to hold that on beat 4. And then lastly, we have an eighth note, and that is the and of beat 4. So this rhythm right here goes like this, and I'm going to count it out loud. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. It's actually the same thing repeated twice if you think about it. The first 2 beats and the last 2 beats are the exact same rhythm. Sometimes when the music gets really complicated with ties, this might be helpful. If it's really complicated, sometimes I just disregard the tie and I play it as is. So in other words, if you have a hard time like holding on beat 2, you want to play something on beat 2, you could try just going ahead and doing that. So if I remove these ties right here and just go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, at least now I have played, you know, all the notes that I'm seeing on that page. Maybe you do that a couple times. At least that might be a good starting point if you're just totally stumped by some of these ties and that's throwing you off. Okay? But then eventually you're going to have to make the switch. Now, when you do make the switch and start including those ties, maybe, at least this is how my brain works, maybe in my mind I'm still thinking, okay, I see that note there on beat 2. I see that visual. So I can hear it in my head, like I can feel beat 2, but now I'm going to hold it and not play it with my thumb. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but when it comes down to it, if you're having a problem with ties, maybe play it a few times without the tie and then add the ties back in. So when we add the ties back in, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, okay? The only way this is really going to work in the beginning is you've got to count. You have got to count. You can count in your head, but I actually encourage you to count out loud. That way we just don't get lazy with it. All right, so what's the point of this line right here that we did? Well, there's actually 2 ways in a piece of music to represent the exact same rhythm. That quarter note tied to that eighth note on 1 and 2 is actually the same exact thing as a dotted quarter note. Okay, so think about that. We said, what is a dotted quarter note total? 1.5 counts. What is a quarter note tied to an eighth note? 1.5 counts. So the bottom line here, and they're explaining it, the only difference between the following measure and the one directly above it that we just played is they are written in different ways, but they are played the same. Listen as I play this bottom line. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now listen to the line above it. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Musically, they're the exact same thing. So why even have the difference? Well, it's a good question because sometimes people like to write it differently. Sometimes people see it differently, even though the end result sounds the same. Personally, I prefer the first line with the ties. This is why. Because on beat 2, I can see something there visually. Now, some people might get confused by that and say, I'm going to play that on beat 2, even though there's a tie there. But when I look at the bottom line, I'm like, beat 2, it's just this empty space. I don't have any clue at that point other than my count. You know, so I don't have that visual. So if you're a very strong visual person, you may prefer the first one. If you're more of an auditory person, you know, music, which is what we're here for, you may prefer the second one. Now, that really only, you know, makes a difference, honestly, if you're writing the piece of music. You can't go to a store and say, let's see, which example do I want? No, it's already in print, so it is what it is. So learn both ways is really what it comes down to. Learn and understand how both ways work, because you're going to see both ways in music. So we're actually going to focus, though, on the bottom one for now, the dotted quarter note and then the eighth note. So when you're counting out the dotted quarter note, whenever you see a dotted quarter note, if it falls on beat 1, you're automatically going to write in your music if you're counting 1 and 2. 1 and 2 represents 1.5 beats. Now, some people get confused on that. They might say 1 and then they're done. But 1 full beat plus another half beat. And that other half beat begins on beat 2. But remember, it's only 2 because the and of beat 2 is the last half of beat 2. So if I counted 1 and 2 and, now I've done 2 full beats, but it's 1.5 beats. So I'm very thorough in my explanation here, only because, I've worked with people who sometimes need that detailed info. Some of you may be way beyond this and ready to move on to page 49, and that's fine. I just want to be very, very thorough. So one more thing at the bottom of 48, the very, very bottom, in 4/4 or 3/4 time, the dotted quarter note is almost always followed by an eighth note. And that's all you're going to see probably in the rest of this book, if I remember correctly. When you have a dotted quarter note, 1.5 beats, expect that last half of beat 2 to have an eighth note, and then boom, you're done with those first full 2 beats. Something else will start again on beat 3, whether it's a quarter note, an eighth note, or another rhythm. So a dotted quarter note is almost always going to be followed by an eighth note, at least for now. Up on page 49. So they're going to show us a couple of measures from some very familiar songs using dotted quarter notes. So these are some tunes that you've probably all heard at some point, maybe even sung, and just never thought about it. Said, oh, I didn't realize I was singing a dotted quarter note. Well, I've even said this like way back in the beginning, one of our first lessons. I think it was Ode to Joy. Or maybe it was Ode to Joy. But when you work on a piano piece here, that is a very familiar tune, that can also be dangerous. Because if it's something you're used to singing so many times, you're liable to just sing it the way you remember it, sing it fast, and just not even give it a thought. But in these lessons, we definitely want to give it all a thought. We want to break it down, understand it, analyze not only what it is that we've been singing all our lives, but what it looks like on paper, analyzing what it is we're doing. So, and as we go through page 49, I want you to recognize these are familiar tunes, but I also want to recognize the notes on the page for what they are. So we're going to go slow. We're going to break it down, and we're going to count it out. Okay? So at the top it says count and clap the notes, play and count, play and sing the words. So we're going to start with looking at just the rhythms first. So since we're going to be playing these notes, I'm not just going to pick a middle C. I'm actually going to clap these, and then we'll play the actual notes that they have on the page. All right, so what that means is where it says C position. So we are going to take our right hand, because it's treble clef, and put it in the C position in just a moment. We're going to clap this rhythm first, all right? Now, again, before you start, always look at your time signature. 3/4 time. So every measure is going to have 3 beats. Do we have any eighth notes? Yes, we do. So we're going to be using the and system for our counts. Look at the very beginning of measure 1. Dotted quarter note. So that's automatically going to be 1 and 2. And then it's followed by the eighth note, which is and then lastly the quarter note, 3 and. Now if you look at the next measure, it's a dotted half note. 3 counts, but it's not 1, 2, 3. 1 and 2 and 3 and. We have to now honor the entire beat. The next 2 measures are the exact same thing again. So let's clap and count it. Here we go. With the count off. 1 and 2 and 3 and. 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 Now as we put our right hand in the middle C position, and we are going to play these notes in just a second, still counting out loud, I only want you to think about the notes. Think about the letter names, think about the intervals, think about these rhythms. Do not even think about this tune yet. Only think about the notes. So here's a count off, and then we'll go. So notice your fourth finger's on F. The other notes here you should be able to sight read pretty easily. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and. Now that you've played it, you may sound very familiar. You did see the words up there. So it's a Christmas tune. Silent Night, Holy Night. So, and if you haven't heard that piece, that's okay. It might be easier for you because all you have to do is focus on notes. But if I told you in the very beginning, I said, we're about to play Silent Night, and you're like, oh, I know that one. You're liable to just start playing it automatically and not even think about it. And you'd be like, but I played it right. And I'd be like, well, that's great. But what happens when we get to a piece you're not familiar with? Do you understand how to do those rhythms, how to interpret that? You know. So again, I'm just focusing on understanding what it is we're doing in familiar pieces. Okay, so going down, middle C position on the next one. As a review, that means both thumbs on middle C. Now, if you look at the treble clef and the bass clef, you're not even playing your left hand to the very last measure. Okay, so your left hand can kind of be, it's there, but remember middle C position, your left hand thumb, if it's not being in use right now, kind of keep it out of the way of your right hand thumb. Okay, so let's go ahead and clap and count this one as well. 4/4 time, 4 beats per measure. You have dotted quarter note at the very beginning, followed by the eighth note. You do not have another one until the third measure, and it's on beat 3. So beats 1 and 2 and are 4 even eighth notes, and then beat 3 is dotted quarter note. So that means 3 and 4, and then finally and is your last eighth note in that measure. Okay? There is a repeat sign, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. So a little count off, and then we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now, if some of you got lost and said, that's too fast, wait, you didn't even go through the counts, let me do that for you. So again, measure 1, the dotted quarter note, you want to write in 1 and 2. Then the eighth note is and. The next quarter note, 3 and. The last quarter note, 4 and. Measure 2, they're all quarter notes, so each quarter note is going to be 1 and, 2 and, 3 and, 4 and. The third measure, those 4 eighth notes are each 1 and 2 and. Dotted quarter note on beat 3, 1.5 beats, that makes it 3 and 4. Our last eighth note is and. Finally, our last measure, quarter note, 1 and, next quarter note, 2 and. Then the half note comes in on beat 3, which is 2 full beats, which is 3 and 4 and. All right, so one more time, we'll do the clapping and counting with the count off. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay, now with the notes. So middle C position, make sure your thumb in the right hand is engaged because it will play middle C first. Let's see if we can sight read these notes. We'll go a little bit slower. Your first note is 5 on G with the count off. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So Going this slow, the piece may not sound that familiar, but it is Deck the Halls, which is another Christmas piece. And it actually goes pretty quick usually. Now, if you try to play it that fast right away as we're learning this counting and those new rhythms, that could be a disaster, actually. So you might also be thinking like, now wait a second, how do I even get it that fast with all the counting? Well, you really have to work your way up to it. We're going kind of slow right now. So you'd be counting like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and eventually it's just like, I feel like I'm rapping. It's so fast. So, I mean, I will let you in on a little secret. It's not really a secret, but to get a piece faster, you do eventually take away the ands when you're counting. Now, I highlight that word eventually. You have to know it so well at the slower pace. Your rhythms have to be locked in place that you can eventually still play the same rhythm without counting the ands. And you might be saying, wait, what are you talking about? Let me demonstrate. The first measure, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Let me count it without the ands, but I'm going to play at the same tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4. You see how that worked? I played it the exact same way. I took out my ands. So if I'm going to go fast, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But easier said than done. Don't try to do that too soon. Don't try to do that too soon. You have to practically memorize the rhythm, if that makes sense. So I'm letting you in on that little secret. You don't have to play this fast right now. That's not really the intention of this. The intention is just going through these slowly, learning these rhythms, understanding it. Some of you might be really ambitious and say, I want to get to that point. There it is. There you go. Make sure your rhythms are locked in place. Start making it a little faster, still counting with those ands. And then finally you get so fast and you're saying, I can't even keep counting anymore. You might be at the point where it's okay not to. Okay. Now, listen very intently. And if your rhythms all of a sudden shift, you weren't ready for it yet. So hope that makes sense. Let's keep moving. Now, middle C position on the third line again. So this, another familiar tune, but let's not think about that yet. Let's just look at the notes. 4/4 time. Notice a pickup note, beat 4 in the left hand, fourth finger on G. Your next measure has a dotted quarter note followed by eighth note. And that last measure, which is actually an incomplete measure, we have a beat 4 at the beginning. The last measure has a dotted quarter note followed by an eighth note as well. Let's see if we can sight read this one. And the first two notes, G, middle C. So there's a little bit of a jump there. With the count off. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and that's all it is. So the right hand starts playing on beat 4 in the second measure and then it continues. So just be careful that doesn't sneak up on you there. So let's do that one more time. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and. The other thing on the first full measure, make sure on beat 4 it's only the right hand playing the E. You don't want this to happen. You don't want that C in the left hand to get lazy. Lift it off as you go down on E on beat 4. And at that point, your left hand's done playing anyways. So Auld Lang Syne is a pretty popular piece, often sung around New Year's. So that's what this piece is. Lastly, we have another familiar tune there at the bottom. It's only in the right hand, the treble clef. This one doesn't have too many notes either, so let's try to sight read this without the clapping. 4/4 time, 4 beats per measure. We're in the C position, middle C, with our thumb as our first note. All right, so with the count off, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 2, and 3, and 4, and. So that's probably the slowest version of Here Comes the Bride you've ever heard in your life. If we played that in a wedding, we would lose our job. But again, we're going slow here, breaking it down. Normally, when you play that or hear that at a wedding, so honestly, if you're looking at this music and playing it that fast, that is actually really fast. If I tried to count that, it would be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So again, going back to what I said earlier, learn it slow with all the counts, the and system. Get it a little faster, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. At that point, switch over, take away the ands, and listen carefully. Make sure your rhythm doesn't change. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, you could say the ands where you play an eighth note. Because actually, it's a little tricky. You have to really think about it. Like at the end of that first measure, I'm saying 4, and then I'm playing the eighth note, and I'm saying 1 on the next measure. So if you want to give that eighth note attention, you could do this. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I think actually that's a little bit easier. For some, it could cause confusion early on as you're learning it, but for some, that actually might be very helpful because now that eighth note isn't just like figure out where to fit it in, because if we figure out where to fit it in, we risk not getting it so precise. But if you say an and right there, that could be helpful too. So I hope that makes sense. All right, so we're at the end of this lesson. So to summarize what we learned today on both pages, you're really ultimately learning about the dotted quarter note. You're learning that it's 1.5 counts. You would count that as 1 and 2. Or when it's on beat 3, 3 and 4. And for now, it's always going to be followed by an eighth note. So again, dotted quarter note, 1 and 2, and then an eighth note on and. You also learned that a dotted quarter note is the same thing musically as a quarter note tied to an eighth note. The exact same thing musically. Visually it looks very different. You also learned about very familiar tunes that use this dotted quarter note. And we learned about forgetting the tune when you're learning a piece of music sometimes. Going slow, writing in the counts, and counting every single note. That way we are precise and we're accurate from the get-go. We build a very strong foundation to build our song off of. If you try to give in and say, look, I can play this, I know this tune, maybe you can. I promise you that eventually that will come back and get you. So, if nothing else, just to understand, what it is you've been singing or playing all your life. Okay? But there will come times where you're going to encounter these rhythms and say, how do you do that? So, this is a very important lesson for that. So, get very familiar with the counting. Make sure it's always the and system. And make sure you're comfortable with these dotted quarter notes. And if you're willing, if you really want to, try to push the tempo up on some of these and see if you can convert it to counting without the ands. And honestly, if you can't do that, if you feel like it's too risky, don't worry about it. That day will come. This only if you're ambitious. So as always, I wish you the best. Please let me know if you have any more questions, comments in the section below. And I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.